Hey everyone, welcome back. We're going to deep dive today into something that's no, it's pretty wild. We're talking about the war in Ukraine and asking the question, is it actually coming to an end?
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? I mean, after years of this stalemate,
I know.
it feels like
Crazy, right?
yeah, it feels almost impossible, but there's this new report from the Associated Press about a high-level meeting that's really got people talking. It could change everything.
You're talking about the meeting between U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov?
Sergei Lavrov,
It's
exactly.
huge. A big deal.
Yeah, the last time these two were even in the same room was at that G20 meeting in India. What was that, like 2 years ago?
Yeah, almost 2 years ago. And since then, I mean, it's been radio silence, right?
Totally.
So to have them, over in Saudi Arabia on neutral ground,
Right.
that's a big deal in and of itself.
Absolutely.
But then to hear what they actually talked about, well, it's even more intriguing.
It really is. The AP report says they agreed on three major points, and these could really change how the U.S. approaches this whole war.
Okay, so break it down for me. What were these agreements?
Well, first, they're aiming to get their embassies back to full staff. After the invasion, both countries kicked out a lot of diplomats. So this is a step, maybe a small step
Yeah.
towards thawing relations a little bit.
Okay, so kind of like dipping a toe back in the water.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's one. What's number two?
Number two, they're putting together a special team, a kind of diplomatic A-team, if you will,
I like it.
to try and jumpstart those peace talks for Ukraine.
Okay, but will it actually lead to peace? I mean, that's
That's the big
big. Okay.
question, yeah.
And there was a third point, right?
Right, there was a third point. And this one's a real head scratcher. They said they're going to explore working together, the US and Russia, that is on economic issues.
Whoa, 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 hold on.
I know.
After years of sanctions and calling Russia, basically a rogue state, now we're talking about cooperating. It feels like a complete 180.
It does, doesn't it? I mean, it makes you wonder if it's for real or if there's something else going on. What's the real motivation here?
It's like everyone just decided to hit the reset button. But did anyone ask Ukraine what they think about all this?
Yeah.
I mean, they're the ones fighting this war.
That's the big question, isn't it? Because there weren't any Ukrainian officials at this meeting. None.
Wow.
And Zelensky, well, he has said he won't sign off on any deal that's made without him at the table. He even postponed his own trip to Saudi Arabia because of this.
Oh, wow. So you can imagine how frustrating this must be for Ukraine. They've sacrificed so much over the past few years, and now it seems like they're being sidelined in these talks. It just doesn't seem right, does it?
It raises a lot of questions about whether this is really about peace or whether there's something else going on behind the scenes. Is the U.S. really trying to de-escalate, or are they just trying to cut their losses and move on? And if they are moving on, what does that mean for Ukraine?
Exactly. Are they going to be pressured into accepting a deal that they don't want just to appease the U.S. and Russia? I mean, that's a huge ethical question, isn't it?
It really is. We can't forget about the human cost of this war. Millions of Ukrainians have been displaced, their homes been destroyed, their families torn apart, their future is completely uncertain. They deserve to have a voice in any decision that affects their country.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in all the diplomatic back and forth and forget that there are real lives at stake here.
Exactly. And it's also important to remember that even if the fighting stops, the scars of this conflict are going to last for generations. Rebuilding trust, repairing the damage, healing the emotional wounds, it's going to be a long and difficult process.
It really puts things into perspective. But, before we go too far down that road, I think it's important to take a step back and look at the bigger picture here. The relationship between the U.S. and Russia, it's been complicated for decades, right? They're like these frenemies locked in a never-ending tango.
That's a great analogy because you can't just jump to the last chapter of this story. To really understand why these talks are such a big deal, we need to flip back a few pages and see how we got here. And honestly, it's been a pretty rocky relationship, to say the least. I mean, just think about 2014 when Russia took Crimea.
Right.
That was a huge red flag for the U.S. and its allies. I mean, it was a clear violation of international law, and it really shattered any trust that had been built up.
Yeah, it was a wake-up call for sure. And then, of course, came the full-scale invasion in 2022.
Which led to a ton of economic sanctions from the U.S. and Europe.
Right.
Diplomats were expelled, communication went dark.
Yeah.
It was the closest we've come to a new Cold War in decades.
It's crazy to think that we went from that level of animosity to, high-level talks in Riyadh. I mean, the war is still going on. Russia hasn't backed down from its demands. And yet here we are talking about thawed relations and economic cooperation. It's mind-boggling.
It really is. It's like they're trying to rewrite the script in real time, but it's hard to tell who's really in control?
Yeah. And what about Ukraine? They're the ones fighting and dying in this war, but they weren't even invited to Riyadh. What does that say about their future?
Well, Zelensky has said very clearly that he won't accept any agreement that doesn't have Ukraine's approval. He sees this as a fight for their survival, and he's not going to be bullied into a bad deal.
It's got to be a nightmare for Ukraine. Imagine you're fighting for your country's survival, and then the people who promise to support you are making deals with your enemy behind your back. That's got to feel like a betrayal, right?
It definitely raises questions about the U.S.'s motives. Are they really committed to helping Ukraine find a just peace? Or are they just looking for a way out, even if it means sacrificing Ukraine's interests?
And what about Europe? I mean, they've been a huge supporter of Ukraine, and they've been hit hard by the economic fallout of this war. How are they reacting to this possible U.S.-Russia deal?
Let's just say they're not thrilled. They're worried about being sidelined, about a deal being struck that doesn't consider their interests or their security concerns. I mean, remember, they're the ones who live right next door to Russia. So they have a lot more at stake here than the U.S. does.
It's like the U.S. is playing chess while Europe is playing checkers. They're thinking about global power dynamics while Europe is worried about things like energy security and refugee flows. It's a totally different set of priorities.
Yeah, and this disconnect is creating a lot of tension within the transatlantic alliance. Europe feels like they've been carrying more than their fair share of the burden, and now they're worried that the U.S. is going to cut and run and leave them to clean up the mess.
This whole situation has really exposed the cracking in that alliance, hasn't it? Makes you wonder if this is the start of a new era where Europe has to start funding for itself.
It's definitely a possibility. The U.S. is focusing more and more on its rivalry with China, and they may not have the resources or the will to keep supporting Europe the way they have in the past.
So if Europe feels betrayed by the U.S. and Ukraine feels abandoned, where does that leave Russia? Are they the winners in all of this?
Well, it's definitely a win for Putin in the short term. He's managed to create a rift between the U.S. and Europe, and he's got them talking about lifting sanctions and maybe even recognizing his territorial gains in Ukraine.
It's a pretty clever strategy. He's playing the long game here, using this war to try and reshape the global order to his advantage. But what about the long-term consequences? Can he really win a war that's turned him into a global pariah that's devastated his economy and that's united the West against him?
That's the big question, isn't it? I mean, it's possible he's overplayed his hand. It's possible this war will backfire and weaken Russia in the long run.
It's a gamble for sure. And speaking of gambles, let's talk about the wild card in all of this. Saudi Arabia. Why are these talks happening there, of all places?
That's a great question. And to understand that, you have to understand Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, as he's known.
Yeah, he's quite a character, isn't he? On the one hand, you've got these accusations of some pretty horrific things like the murder of Jamal Khashoggi.
Right.
But on the other hand, he's trying to present himself as this global leader, a peacemaker, a modernizer in the Middle East.
He's playing a complicated game, for sure. He wants to stay close with Russia, especially through that OPEC plus oil cartel.
Okay, so back up for a second. Explain that a little bit more. How does OPEC plus tie Russia and Saudi Arabia together?
So OPEC Plus is this group of oil-producing countries, and they basically work together to control the supply and price of oil worldwide.
Okay.
Russia's a major player in OPEC Plus, and Saudi Arabia is the leader, so they have a strong reason to cooperate, even if they don't always agree on other things.
So even though they've got their differences, they need each other. It's like a business partnership where you have to put up with your annoying coworker because you both need the paycheck.
Exactly. It's a marriage of convenience, but it's a powerful one, and MBS is trying to use that power to increase Saudi Arabia's influence on the world stage.
So hosting these talks is a way for him to show the world that he's a major player, that he can bring even the most bitter rivals to the negotiating table. It's a power move, isn't it?
Absolutely. He's positioning himself as a mediator, a peacemaker, a guy who can get things done. And whether you admire his ambition or find it unsettling, you can't deny that he's a force to be reckoned with.
It's a bold strategy for sure. But is it working? Is he really shaping events, or is he just playing at being a global power broker?
It's too early to say for sure, but he's definitely making waves. And the fact that the U.S. and Russia chose to meet in Saudi Arabia on his turf, well, that speaks volumes.
It's like they're acknowledging that the old rules don't apply anymore. The world is changing, new power centers are emerging, and the U.S. can't just dictate terms anymore.
Exactly. And this whole situation, this potential peace deal, this diplomatic dance, it's all a symptom of that larger shift. We're entering a new era of global politics, and the future is anything but certain.
Yeah, it's a little unnerving, isn't it? This feeling that the ground is shifting beneath our feet. But that's the reality of the world we live in. Things are constantly changing, and we have to be ready to adapt.
Right. And that's why it's so important to stay informed, to understand the forces that are shaping our world, and to think critically about the information we're consuming.
Couldn't agree more. And that brings us back to this meeting in Riyadh and the question that we've been asking this whole deep dive. Is this the beginning of the end of the war in Ukraine? I mean, it's the question everyone's asking, right? We've got this potential diplomatic thaw, but at the same time, Russia is still attacking Ukraine. It's like We're balancing on a knife's edge here.
Yeah, it's a really delicate situation, and there are signs that the U.S. might be pushing for a deal, even if it means Ukraine has to make some tough compromises.
Well, you're talking about what U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said last week, right?
Exactly. He kind of hinted that Ukraine joining NATO is probably off the table.
And he suggested that Ukraine might have to accept not getting all of its territory back. And those are two of Putin's biggest demands. It sounds like the U.S. might be setting the stage for a deal that really favors Russia.
It's possible, and it's definitely making people nervous, not just in Ukraine, but in Europe, too. I mean, they've poured so much support into Ukraine. They don't want to see all that effort go to waste, especially if Russia ends up benefiting from it.
So what does all this mean for the average person? Someone like our listener who's trying to make sense of all this. Could this actually be the beginning of the end of the war? Or is this just another chapter in a long and bloody conflict?
Honestly, it's still way too early to say, for sure. This meeting in Riyadh is just the first step in what's probably going to be a really long and messy process. And even if they do reach a peace agreement, the road to recovery is going to be incredibly difficult.
Yeah, and even if the fighting stops tomorrow, the scars of this war are going to be visible for generations. We're talking about a humanitarian crisis, millions of displaced people, wrecked economies, and a whole generation that's been traumatized by violence.
Absolutely. The human cost of this war is immeasurable. Those wounds are going to take a very long time to heal.
It's a lot to think about. But even in the darkest times, there's always hope, right? And maybe, just maybe, this meeting in Riyadh is a sign that things are finally starting to move in the right direction.
It's a glimmer of hope, for sure. And whether it turns out to be a false start or the beginning of something new, one thing is clear. This war has changed the world, and its impact will be felt for a long time.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder that we're all connected. What happens on one side of the world can have ripple effects that touch all of us.
It really highlights how important it is to stay informed, to understand what's happening in the world, and to use our voices to advocate for peace and justice.
Couldn't agree more. To keep up with the ever-changing global landscape and understand the forces shaping our world, subscribe to The Global Take. Thanks for joining us on this